One possible answer relies on establishing a difference between higher and lower pleasures, and arguing that the major works of great artists provide a higher kind of pleasure compared to that provided by lighter or more minor works that may still require considerable skill and talent. Can such a difference be elaborated convincingly? John Stuart Mill attempts to do so in the essay Utilitarianism. He is not expressly concerned with the question of the value of art, but it is hard to see how any such distinction could be drawn other than in the ways he suggests. According to Mill, there are only two possibilities. Either we say that higher pleasures hold out the possibility of a greater quantity of pleasure, or we say that a higher pleasure is of a different quality. The first of these alternatives is plainly adequate because it makes the value of art strictly commensurable with that of other pleasures. If the only difference is that pleasure in art is more concentrated, it can be substituted without loss by more items affording a lower pleasure. Thus, if what Tolstoy's Anna Karenina has over friends or neighbors is quantity of pleasure, we can make up the difference simply by watching more episodes of Friends. In fact, we don't even have to confine ourselves to similar sorts of thing. Food is often a pleasure, so we could make up for any lack of artistic pleasures by eating more of the food we especially like. The implication of this line of thought is that people who have never acquired any familiarity with any of the things that pass for serious art, including the serious elements in folk art, are in no way impoverished, provided only that they have had a sufficient quantity of more mundane pleasures. Pizza is as good as poetry, we might say. A modern version of a famous remark by Bentham. Most of us would want to dissent from such a judgment. But whether we do or not, the fact of this implication is enough. to show that the pleasure theory of art understood in this way is inadequate, since it cannot show art to have any special value at all. Mill thinks that it is absurd that the estimation of pleasures should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. Instead, he appeals to the respective quality of different pleasures. If I am asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another merely as a pleasure, except its being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality. On a question which is the best worth having of two pleasures, the judgment of those who are qualified by knowledge of both, or, if they differ, that of the majority among them, must be admitted as final. Mill, 1985, 14 through 15. According to Mill, this higher quality of pleasure must more than compensates for any diminution in quantity, and will in fact offset a good deal of pain and discontent. In a famous passage, he concludes, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the pig or the fool is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question." Mill, 1985, 14. Whether Mill's account of higher and lower pleasures is adequate for his purposes in utilitarianism is not the question here. Rather, we want to ask whether the same strategy can be used to explain the difference in value that is attached to light and serious art. And the answer plainly seems to be that it does not. This is chiefly because, as we know, tastes differ in art, and consequently, the test he proposes cannot be used to adjudicate between competing responses to kinds of art. Let us take the case of grand opera versus soap opera as both a test and an illustration. Wagner's Ring Cycle is an astonishing amalgamation of three major artistic forms: musical, visual, and dramatic, on an immense scale. In the estimation of many people, it represents one of the greatest artistic achievements of all time. Television soap operas like Dallas are also very protracted, continuing through a vast number of episodes, and they combine the visual and the dramatic. But generally speaking, they have poor dialogue and hackneyed plots. No one heralds them as major artistic creations, and the names of their script writers and directors are virtually unknown. Employing Mill's test, then, it ought to be the case that a competent judge who has seen both will prefer grand opera to soap opera. Suppose that someone who has seen both and is asked to judge expresses a preference for the grand opera. How are we to tell that they are a competent judge? The mere fact that they have seen both and will not suffice, because tastes differ, and it may be the case, therefore, that the preference expressed does not arise from the perception of a higher pleasure, but from a liking for grand opera. Someone else asks the same question, who has also seen both, might have a taste for soap opera, and so express a different preference. Consequently, it has to be Mill's majority test that must do the work. Now, if we assume, almost certainly without foundation, that majority opinion among those who have seen both favors grand opera, we still have no reason to infer from this that the works of Wagner generate a higher quality of pleasure than episodes of Dallas. The larger number of votes for the former may signal nothing more than that taste for grand opera is in the majority. Suppose, more plausibly, that the vote goes the other way and the majority express a preference for soap opera. We can conclude that more people get more pleasure from soap opera than grand opera, which seems almost certainly true to me. What we cannot infer is that the normal estimation that puts grand opera on a higher scale than soap opera, artistically speaking, is mistaken. We cannot show that beer is better than wine simply by showing that more people prefer it. The suggestion that we can just begs the question in the present context. The fact that people really enjoy soap opera does not make the dialogue any more sophisticated or the plots any less hackneyed. It might be said that construing Mill's test in terms of taste ignores an important suggestion. Higher pleasures involve the higher faculties. This is what makes them of a higher quality. Such seems certainly to be Mill's view, and it is what justifies him in discounting the opinions of the fool and the pig. Their experience is of a lower order, and hence their pleasures are too. Applied to the subject of art, what this implies is that serious art engages aspects of the mind that lighter art does not address or even attempt to. In general, this seems to be true. Great art, literary, musical, visual, dramatic, tends to make considerable demands on us of attention and concentration, whereas light art is much less demanding. However, it is not clear how this would make a difference to the relative value of the two in terms of pleasure. It is easy to accept Mill's claim that there is more to human life than eating, sleeping, and procreating. And it seems to follow that human beings can expect to enjoy a range of pleasures that are closed to pigs, because human beings have innate endowments of mind and emotional capacity that pigs do not. But these evident differences give us no reason to think that the engagement of a higher capacity brings a different kind of pleasure that can be ranked higher. Pigs cannot do crosswords, and fools cannot while away the time with mathematical brain teasers. Such activities undoubtedly engage higher faculties, but this of itself does not give us reason to think that the pleasure we derive from them is of a more valuable, higher kind than the pleasure to be found in, say, sunbathing or ice cream. We can define higher pleasures as those that involve the higher faculties if we choose. But this is mere stipulation. It does not help us to identify a distinctive property that would validate the claim that crosswords and the like are more significant or important than other pleasurable pastimes. the nature of pleasure, so far, it has proved impossible to ground the value or importance of art on pleasure or entertainment value. The concept of pleasure with which Mill is operating is one of a mental or psychological experience that different things can cause in us roughly opposite to pain. Since it is a commonplace that there are different kinds of pain, some much more intense than others, the idea of discriminating between pleasures in terms of their intensity seems plausible. But arguably, this is a mistaken understanding of the nature of pleasure. An older understanding that goes back to Aristotle holds that pleasure is not itself an experience, but something that supervenes upon experience. What this means is that the pleasure we derive from an activity is not an after effect of the activity, in the way that being slightly drunk is the after effect of a few glasses of wine. Pleasure, rather, is the manner in which we engage in that activity. If I play a game for pleasure, this is to be contrasted with playing it for money, or because I am compelled to, or because I can think of nothing else to do. And it means that I am playing it for the sake of the game itself. What I enjoy when I play tennis for pleasure is not an experience called pleasure which arises as I walk off the court. An experience that might be compared with the pleasure generated by music as I leave the concert hall, say. What I enjoy is the business of playing tennis. This alternative account of pleasure leads to an important shift in the line of thought we have been examining in the course of this chapter. If enjoyment or pleasure in the arts is a mode or manner in which we engage with them, whether as artists or as spectators, then it is in the arts themselves that their value is to be found, and not in the pleasurable feelings that may or may not arise from them. We can repeat and refine the question with which we are concerned. Is there an intrinsic feature of the arts that gives them special value? And if so, what could it be? One long-standing answer is beauty, and this will form the central topic of the next chapter. Chapter 2, Art and Beauty. Beauty and pleasure. In the previous chapter, we explored the idea that the value of the arts lies in the pleasure we derive from them, and saw that such a view is insufficient to explain what is special about the arts over other sources of pleasure, and what makes some artworks serious and others light. Accordingly, we are still in search of something that will enable us to explain art's special value. To have reached this point is not necessarily to have put the concept of pleasure behind us, because some philosophers have thought that what is special about art is a distinctive kind of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure. The Polish philosopher Roman Ingarden, for instance, urges us to recognize that aesthetic pleasures have a special character of their own and exist in a different manner from the pleasures deriving from a good meal or fresh air or good bath. What could this pleasure be? One obvious answer is the pleasure that accompanies beauty. It has been observed from ancient times that it seems contradictory to describe something as beautiful and deny that we are in any way pleasurably affected by it. The same thing would not be true of a large range of concepts that can be used without any personal evaluative implication or overtone. Color words are like this. People do often prefer one color to another, and can even be said to have a favorite color. But we can't know this from their use of color words alone. If I describe an apple as red, you cannot draw the inference that I favor it in some way. Perhaps I only like green apples. But if I describe it as beautiful red apple, you can tell at once that I regard it in a positive light. Whereas we can apply color words like red and green without committing ourselves to a favorable estimation of the things we apply to them. We automatically praise something when we call it beautiful and criticize it when we describe it as ugly. But this raises an important philosophical question. What is the connection between a purely descriptive term like red or green and the evaluative term beautiful? There are two possibilities that philosophers have discussed at great length. The first is that the connection is purely subjective. That is to say, whereas terms like red and green identify real properties of the apple, the term beautiful says something about the person who uses it. This is the view embodied in the familiar saying that Beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. And it is exactly the view we found Hume espousing in the previous chapter. To seek the real beauty or the real deformity is as fruitless as inquiry as to seek the real or the real sweet or the real bitter. Now, there are two principal objections to such a view. The first is one that Hume's Scottish contemporary Thomas Reid brought against him. If saying that this is a beautiful red apple means I like, love, value, prefer this red apple, why don't I just say that? Why cast my opinion in such a misleadingly objective form, as though it were about the apple, when in fact it is about me and my feelings towards it? The other objection is this: if judgments of beauty are purely subjective, why does anyone bother to argue about them? De gustibus non disputandum, an ancient Latin saying goes. There can be no disputing over matters of taste. If I say, I like the taste of avocado, whereas you do not, how could there be any point in arguing about it? I can't give you reasons to like the taste of avocado. You just don't. But when it comes to judgments of beauty, then people do argue. What is more, for the practical purposes of buying paintings and sculptures, judging flower competitions, awarding fashion prizes, granting scholarships, they need to argue. We want to award the prize to the most beautiful roses. We want to choose the most beautiful painting submitted in the competition. We want to buy the most beautiful recording of a piece of music, etc. In the face of these objections, subjectivists about beauty need not concede defeat. But what they must do is add to their account what is called an error theory. If they want to interpret beauty statements subjectively, they must also explain why ordinary language and practice seems to be in error about them. Why do human beings go on speaking in a misleadingly objectivist way about beauty? Why do they engage in arguments that cannot in the end be any more than simple confrontations? And why do they run competitions that cannot have any rational outcome? A philosophically astute subjectivist can offer answers to these questions. But it seems more desirable not to have to answer them in the first place. In other words, the need for error theories of this kind seems to give the alternative, objectivist account of beauty a natural advantage. However, it also faces two important difficulties. The first trades precisely upon that fact that people do disagree over judgments of beauty. If beauty were an objective matter like the color of a thing, why would there be so much disagreement? Furthermore, this disagreement is to be found not just between individuals, but across times and cultures. Different cultures have different ideals of beauty, and these ideals change as time passes. Surely, if beauty and ugliness were real properties of objects that we discover in the way we discover chemical properties, say, there would be a steady convergence of opinion over time. A second objection is this: everyone agrees that beauty attracts and ugliness repels. That is to say, an important part of judging something to be beautiful or ugly lies in human response to an object and not just the nature of the object itself. But how could an objective property in and of itself be guaranteed to move us? Surely, for any property that lies purely in the object, we can regard it with either enthusiasm or indifference. It is possible to reply to this second objection by acknowledging that beauty is not like red or green. Beauty is inferred from more basic descriptive properties in the way that guilty and innocent are. Someone accused of a crime, it really is either guilty or innocent. It is not enough for people, even the majority, simply to believe that they are. But guilt and innocence are not properties that can be seen by an eyewitness. They have to be inferred from the observations of eyewitnesses. The same is true of judgments of beauty, someone might allege. Beauty is a higher order property, so to speak, whose presence we infer from other more directly observable properties. The trouble with this reply, however, is that the analogy is hard to sustain. In the case of guilt and innocence, the law provides us with principles by means of which we can infer one or the other from the evidence of eyewitnesses. But what are the equivalent laws or principles of beauty? There do not seem to be any. We can say, if we wish, that aesthetic properties like beauty are inferred from non-aesthetic properties like red. But what is to validate these inferences? Kant on beauty. It seems then that between subjectivist and objectivist accounts of beauty there is a standoff. some aspects of the way we talk and act support a subjectivist interpretation, and others support an objectivist interpretation. How then are we to judge between them? This is the problem addressed by one of the greatest modern philosophers, and possibly the thinker who has had the most enduring influence on contemporary ideas of art and aesthetics, Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804. The motivation behind most of Kant's philosophy was the pressing need to resolve certain fundamental antinomies. An antinomy is a conflict between two contradictory propositions, both of which appear to be provable by reason. For instance, human beings have free will and can choose what to do. At the same time, they are physical objects, subject to deterministic laws of nature. By focusing on the first, we can prove that the second cannot be true. But by focusing on the second, we can equally prove that the first cannot be true. How is such an antinomy to be resolved? The standoff we have just been considering with respect to the nature of beauty can be interpreted as an antinomy of sorts. It seems that the ascription of beauty can equally well be interpreted as an exercise of rational judgment and as an expression of personal sentiment or feeling. But both cannot be true, and so we seem to have a philosophical impasse. It is principally this problem that Kant addresses in the Critique of Judgment, his great work on aesthetics, first published in 1790. This was a late work of Kant's because earlier in his philosophical career, he had thought that aesthetic appreciation was purely subjective, simply a matter of pleasure. Kant draws a sharp distinction between feeling and reason, and on the face of it, experience of pleasure cannot be rational or irrational, any more than a pain can be rational or irrational, because it is part of our sensitive rather than our intellectual nature. Either things give us pleasure or they don't. But Kant came to the view that the aesthetic is a special kind of pleasure precisely because it in some sense transcends mere individual preference. Aesthetic pleasure, or pleasure in the beautiful, is something we can expect others to experience at the same time as ourselves. That is not to say that everyone does share the pleasure that is found in beautiful things. It means, rather, that pleasure in the beautiful is a pleasure it is proper to commend to others. To this extent, appreciating the beautiful is an act of the mind as well as a matter of sensuous feeling. And that is why it is correct to speak of aesthetic judgment. The task of the critique of judgment is to give an adequate account of its special character. The critique of judgment is Kant's third critique. The first, the critique of pure reason, is concerned with how human minds can have knowledge of the world outside them. How science is possible, if you like. The second, the critique of practical reason, is an attempt to discern the principles that make action rational and morality possible. The third critique accounts for the aesthetic by locating it in relation to these other two. Kant places aesthetic judgment between the logically necessary mathematical theorems, for example, and the purely subjective expressions of personal taste. Though the proposition, "this is beautiful," does indeed have the appearance of a cognitive judgment, that is, a judgment about how things are, Kant agrees with Hume that expressing such a judgment cannot be other than subjective, that is, arising from a feeling of approval. But in contrast to Hume, he rejects the view that the experience of beauty is merely subjective. This is because, although Hume thinks that the attribution of beauty to an object reflects a sentiment or feeling within us, Kant is aware that this is not how it seems to us. As with a judgment about fact or necessity. The person who declares something to be beautiful can find as reason for his delight no personal conditions to which his own subjective self might alone be party, and therefore must believe that he has reason for demanding a similar delight from everyone. Accordingly, he will speak of the beautiful as if beauty were a quality of the object and the judgment logical, although it is only aesthetic and contains merely a reference of the representation of the object to the subject. In plainer language, the idea is this. While it is true that beauty needs to be appreciated subjectively, when we see beautiful things, we are aware that the pleasure we derive from them is not a function of something peculiar to us, some personal condition to which our own subjective self might alone be party. Beauty is subjective, but it is not merely personal, as the expression of a preference is when we refer to something of which we happen to be especially fond. A tune that has personal associations, for example, or a favorite dish. Kant gives the example of a preference for Canary wine. Someone who expresses a preference for the light, sweet wine from the Canary Islands over the heavier port wine that comes from Portugal does no more than express a personal liking and has no reason to expect others to share this preference. But in declaring an object to be beautiful, we think we have a reason for demanding a similar delight from everyone. An aesthetic judgment is thus to be distinguished as one that falls between the universally necessary or logical and the merely personal. But it occupies another middle ground as well. The middle ground between being merely pleasant or agreeable and being demonstrably good or useful. Delight in the beautiful is neither of these. Suppose I fancy a particular hat. This is a matter of my finding it attractive. Suppose, though, I also think it especially good at keeping my head warm and dry. This is a demonstrable matter. It can be shown to be true or not. In this second case, my judgment, Kant believes, arises from the concept of the end that is to be served. Hats are for keeping our moisture and for retaining heat. Once a given end or purpose is specified, then whether something is good, i.e., useful to that end, is not a matter of taste, but a matter of fact. Now, the aesthetic case does not seem to fit either of these exactly. Beautiful objects don't merely catch our fancy. They seem more significant than that. But neither do they seem to have any special purpose. Art is not design. So, the distinguishing characteristic of the aesthetic must lie in this. It is free but not purely fanciful. In Kant's terminology, an aesthetic judgment is disinterestedly free. In Kant's terminology, the aesthetic judgment is disinterestedly free. It has, in one of his most famous expressions, purposefulness without purpose. When I find something beautiful, it is purposeful, but it does not have some specific purpose that might make it useful to me. Aesthetic judgment is thus to be distinguished: 1. From a judgment of fact, because it is subjective. 2. From the merely subjective, because it commands the assent of others. 3, from a judgment grounded in practical rationality, because the beautiful has no practical purpose. And 4, from the merely fanciful or superficially attractive, because it has the mark of purposefulness. What sort of judgment is it that falls between these alternatives? Kant's answer is a judgment arising from the free play of the imagination. In contemporary English, this expression suggests a greater degree of license than Kant intends, perhaps because imagination is often confused with fancy. If the two are different, it is because imagination, unlike fancy, is constrained or disciplined in some way. But what way? The answer cannot be truth or fact, since these determine our judgments and thereby undermine their freedom. I am not free to decide what causes cancer, as I am free to choose what coat to wear. The crucial point is that while the play of the imagination has to be free, it must also be able to command universal assent, just as a claim to knowledge or usefulness does. To explain this curious double nature, Kant postulates a sensus communis, or common sensitive nature, among humans that is invoked and appealed to when a judgment of taste is made. This shared sense is not the same as shared knowledge about the objective properties of classes of things, like the knowledge that aspirin relieves pain, say. If it were, it would lose what is distinctive to aesthetic judgments, their subjective freedom. That is why aesthetic judgments are not about classes of things at all, but about individual objects. In Kant's language, judgments of taste must be invariably laid down as a singular judgment upon the object. So, when I declare something to be beautiful, I am not placing it within a general category of beautiful things, as I place aspirin within the category painkiller. I am focused upon and delighting in this particular object. Delight in the beautiful is fixed upon an object instead of an intellectual classification. It consists in contemplation of the object itself.